now gives me great pleasure to introduce you, ladies and gentlemen, to the wonderful Ruth Allington, who is going to talk to us about the effective dialogue and the persuasive power of listening. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together, and Ruth, over to yourself. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Sarah. Could I just double check that you're seeing my opening slide?
We are. Your timing was perfect.
Fantastic. So I'd just like to start with a short introduction to myself. My education and training is in engineering geology originally, but over an almost 40-year career, I've become a specialist in resource evaluation, primarily for construction materials and the design of quarries to recover them responsibly. For construction materials, geology is obviously fundamental, but timescales are much, much shorter than in, for example, metal mining, both for developing a project and for the life of the quarry itself. It's the topic of another talk, but essentially I've spent 40 years or so working with ESG through optimization of all of the non-geological constraints and considerations, the modifying factors in minerals reporting language. The concept of temporary use of land is very much alive in this world, and the geological part is usually actually the easiest and the shortest part. But I say again, obviously not unimportant, fundamental. But along the way in this career, I've acquired experience initially by accident and much later on by design. Experience in professional qualifications in dispute resolution and facilitation. Initially, I acted. I had the opportunity to act as an expert witness, and later I became involved in alternative dispute resolution as a mediator. And it's on that area of my professional practice that I want to focus today, highlighting the value that the skills and experience that I value can add to ESG performance. So we're going from the very big pictures that we've heard so far in the conference to the essence of some professional skills and tools that we can use. So I want to start by examining the issues that arise from a hint at the bottom of this really excellent Satala summary of how to map your stakeholders as part of enterprise risk management training that they offer. Very many thanks to Satala for permission to share this with you. And as an aside, I can personally recommend Satala training, some of which will be offered next week. This is a really great hint. It's simple and to the point. But I want to concentrate today on how we figure out what these perspectives are. Oh, sorry, the clicking's gone amiss. There we go. As you see on my slide, there are some key influences that make this quite difficult. Making assumptions and acting on our preconceived ideas will inevitably be wrong, in my experience. Somehow we need to find out the best way to establish what these perspectives are. And the best way we could do that could be to ask them. But this turns out to be extraordinarily difficult for us to do. So I want to look a bit more at the framework on this excellent fact sheet for mapping and creating our communication and consultation strategies with each group of stakeholders and introduce the concept of trust. As you see, where there's a high degree of trust, acceptance, stakeholders tend to fall in the bottom left, so low interest, lower influence. These are likely to be more supportive of our project and less engaged. But things happen that suddenly change this. For example, a community that gives its informed consent to a project that it rather likes, that gives it economic stability, lots of community, lots of jobs and so on, will very quickly withdraw that consent when faced with a reality that's different from what they thought they had been promised. Sometimes what they actually had been promised, but I use those words advisedly, what they thought they had been promised. A low level of trust or acceptance in a proposal or project leads to a likelihood of more hostility and more engagement. And we see that in daily life, in the vaccine debates, in political debates, and so on. Stakeholders cannot be pigeonholed for all time. I was really struck yesterday to hear Ludivine Wouters identify her top pick as a key element of the ESG toolbox for making ESG a reality. She identified the creation of a culture where stakeholders no longer believe that they belong only to one category. So you might think from that, that because we are all in fact stakeholders in more than one category at any one time, that it would make it easier for us to all understand the perspectives of other stakeholders like us. But my experience tells me that's just simply not true. We find it difficult to unravel where we individually sit as stakeholders, and even more impossible to unravel what motivates and drives the attitudes and perceptions of other stakeholders. I think this may be because we operate within systems and cultures that label us and put us in silos. Families, tribes, interest groups, power bases, call them what you will. And those systems have us represent those systems and cultures at different times. Many of you may recognize what is happening in my cartoon here. This is a snapshot of a really familiar scenario, at least it's really familiar to me. Here are two people, or groups of people, represented by two people, locked in debate mode over, for example, a permit application for a new open pit mine. They are both human beings, both presumably citizens, consumers, perhaps employees, members of families and other communities, but here they are representing two stakeholder groups. Each party brings forward their best arguments, they do their research, evidence is pitted against emotion, they recruit others to side with them. Lawyers and consultants make a lot of money making their cases for them. They create and exploit power imbalances. Everything escalates. It's too difficult for anyone to concede. There's no possibility for common ground. They simply don't speak the same language. They get nowhere, and so they try to convince independent decision makers. In this example, typically a planning inspector or a judge or an arbitrator. They try to use force of their argument to persuade the decision maker. They push it off to somebody else to decide. The decision maker decides between the 2 points of view. Someone wins and the other loses. You're not listening. I've already told you that. You are being unreasonable are the sorts of phrases we use to each other and to the other side. But what is really going on? What's stopping these people hearing what the other has to say? What is going on is that the actual fundamental views, the feelings and needs of the parties are unspoken and unacknowledged. Neither is understood and both feel powerless. This is a version of what Marshall Rosenberg calls violence in communication. Now that sounds like a very strong word to use, but please note that violence in this context, when it was used by Marshall Rosenberg in communication, is described as not necessarily aggressive or intentionally confrontational or damaging. Persuading someone to do something for their own good, or because it's the least worst option, or in their best interest, or because society needs minerals, for example, does come very often from the best of intentions, but it's still violent in these terms. It's wanting for others what they do not want at this present time for themselves. So the way this plays out is that if the mining company wins and gets its permit, my experience is that it's actually relatively easy to establish good community relations once it's inevitable that the project will go ahead. You might say that the S is okay then. We've been through a storm, but the S is okay. There is social license, public acceptance after all. But the impact of the playing out of this type of fight can be incredibly damaging in the long term. And I'm not just talking about the money that's spent and the emotional damage. But it's really typical for those involved in the fight on behalf of the mining company or the quarrying company to make concessions and offers along the way to reach a settlement. They want to get on with it. They want the project to succeed. It follows as night follows day that some or all of these will be simply undeliverable in the operational phase, safely, profitably, or even at all. Even if things settle down with the local community and other stakeholders, this is hardly a recipe for sustainability in any sense. We heard quite a lot about the systemic and cultural problems yesterday. So this cartoon indicates how, in this case, mediation based on the principles of non-violent communication can help the parties create a respectful connection that can provide the conditions in which they can co-create strategies that will resolve the dispute to both sides' satisfaction. This is not about compromise. Most approaches at resolution seek compromise, which means very, very often, usually I'd say, that everybody gives something up and neither side is satisfied. The mediator or facilitator helps to translate the language of judgment and blame and the manifestation of power imbalances into language that builds trust, empathy, and openness. Effective visionary leaders create cultures naturally where this happens. And what do we see? We see successful organizations, successful businesses, the kind of joined up vision, joined up delivery, thought about targets that are outcome focused that Elaine took us through yesterday in her talk. If you haven't heard yesterday's talks, I do recommend them all to you. The change that is facilitated is that each party feels heard and aims to understand, even if not to agree with the other party's point of view. If we understand, we can start to look at the differences and strategies to accommodate them. So the mediator and the parties here are co-creating conditions in which change and the building of solutions with consent are possible. So in my example of a mediator working with stakeholders with opposing and conflicting views, the mediator's role is not so much to resolve the dispute, but rather to help the parties to create the conditions in which they can find a way to resolve it. You can see on the right-hand side a range of skills and roles for a mediator or facilitator working in this way. Training and education is key to creating systems in which this way of communicating is embedded. Resolving conflicts with the help of a trained facilitator is one thing, but truly creating a system that seeks connection, accountability, and understanding and allows for challenge in a safe and constructive way is quite another. The need for culture change, top-down clarity of purpose and vision and accountability, the risks created by specialists working in silos were key issues discussed in yesterday's opening session. I just want to finish there by saying two things. One is that that I value the training I've received in this area more highly than any other professional, technical, or scientific skills I've acquired in my entire career. That is not to say that my other skills are not fundamental to my professional practice. They are fundamental, and I don't regret acquiring them. But it is to say that I can use these skills and insights many times to make my scientific and technical knowledge and skills many times more effective with the overlay, or sometimes I call it the seasoning, of these facilitative and dialogue skills. On Wednesday, Maria Arper will be presenting her dialogue roadmap as a skillful and responsible methodology for consulting with diverse stakeholders with different priorities, which is rooted in non-violent communication. I certainly recommend listening to that talk to give you some more insights as to how this transition from debate to dialogue, from conflict to co-creation can happen. That was a whistle-stop tour, and thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so, so much, Ruth. So ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for the wonderful Ruth Allington. Thank you so, so much, Ruth. That was brilliant. And we've got a number of questions that are coming in for you now, Ruth. So the first one comes from Haluk, and it's in on the Q&A. And Haluk asks, what is the main focusing point or problem when debating with stakeholders based on your experience? They then go on to say, sometimes professional linguistic or languages can be a big problem when explaining a project to people. Any comments on that?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think the key is learning to listen more and speak less. And I find, in fact, that where there are differences in language, not only in the linguistic sense, but also in technical language and vocabulary, if those things are attended to in the way that we express ourselves, and we constantly check back, we can more easily see the opportunity. So if I say to a lawyer that I really think we need to examine the flood risk in this particular area, I will need to explain that in a way that's accessible to the lawyer, and so I need to pitch what I say, but I'm not explaining this very well. But yeah, you saw in my slides that in the cartoon of, you know, when it was all a little bit better, a dialogue, the parties were saying to each other, what I heard you say is da 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 da. They were checking back all the time, and I find myself, because of the way I've been trained and the work that I do, I'd really recommend that. It's a route to really deeply engaging with somebody if you repeat back what you heard them say, because if it's wrong, they will correct you. If you just assume either that what you told somebody has landed in the way you intended it to land, or that what you received was what they intended for you to receive, you're almost bound to be wrong. And then you start to get a conversation going. You start to understand the other person. So nothing is wrong and nothing is right. If you go into a conversation like this seeking to tell people stuff, it simply doesn't land. So relaxing, 2 of these, 1 of these, and remembering to use those in at least that ratio. Listening until it's almost too painful to continue listening, because you're desperate to put in your point of view. But it really pays off if you give somebody your attention by listening and then reflecting back what you heard them say. They will want to give you their attention, and at that point they will hear what you have to say.
And I guess with that as well then, Ruth, it's when you're trying to summarize or ensure that you have heard and understood correctly, not being afraid to be wrong in terms of...
Not being afraid to be wrong, and being very careful about judgments. So just finding ways to reflect back without judgment. So what I heard you say is that you're frightened that this tailings dam will fail and engulf your village, and frankly that's daft. I mean, you know, it's simply acknowledging how people are feeling and what they're needing, you know, trying to really get to that What do they need? Do they need security? Do they need reassurance? Do they need money? You know, what is it that they need? And it's usually something that you might not guess at.
Brilliant. No, thank you so much for that, Ruth. And there continue to be questions coming in both chat and Q&A. And actually one of those questions is from the next speaker. So actually, rather than pose that, I'm going to take this as an opportunity to say another massive thank you to the fantastic Ruth.